Welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon and I'm the host of A Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. And welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Sharon, and welcome everyone to this podcast called Evidence-Based Teaching, What is it? And welcome back to Misty Adoniou. It's great having you on another podcast. How is everything?
Everything's good, coming to you from Ngunnawal land, Phil. Canberra, the capital city of Australia.
Fantastic. And can you remind everyone about your background again?
Sure. So I trained as a primary school teacher and taught in primary schools for a lot of years. Firstly in mainstream, but moving into English additional language teaching in the intensive English centres here. Then I moved to Greece with my family and continued teaching over there, but of course that was English as a foreign language. And then I came back to Australia 7 or 10 years later and began teaching in teacher education at the University of Canberra, so training the teachers. And I did that all the way up until 2019 when I left the university and have gone into private consultancy where I mostly work with government, but also independent and the Catholic school sectors. And I do a range of things, Phil, but one of the things that I really enjoy doing is that I get back in the classroom and I walk my talk and teach young children to read and write, because I think it's important that if you're making claim to being an expert in the field, then you should be somebody who can practice in the field as well.
It's a really important point because that's something that sometimes happens out there and sometimes doesn't.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's one of the big complaints that teachers often have about their own teacher education is often, I feel like they were in an ivory tower, they didn't know anything about teaching. But my experience of teacher education faculties is that there are a lot of teachers in there who went in there to make teacher education better and more relevant. And I was one of those who decided that I loved my work in the classroom, but I could do a really good job helping teachers as well in their training. And so, that's what I moved into. But gee, you can't rest on your laurels. You can't say, well, I was a teacher 20 years ago, because things change. And so it's really important to spend time in the classroom actually doing the teaching.
Yeah, and you would have noticed some big changes over all those years too, I'm sure.
I have. I have.
So our topic today, evidence-based teaching, it's kind of a catchphrase out there. What is it actually? What are people meaning by evidence-based?
So we just take it at its face value, right? We just take those words. It just essentially means teaching that's resulted in some observable, positive learning outcomes for students. So that's what we're all looking for. That's our evidence, right? That, I can observe it and it was a positive outcome for the student. And so that's the kind of teaching we're all seeking to do. So I'd say that's what evidence-based teaching is. And everybody should feel pretty safe that they've been schooled in evidence-based teaching when they were back at university, and that they actually do it every day. Every day is what a teacher does. They're just observing to see whether their teaching had an impact, for whom it had an impact, and when it didn't have an impact, what they would change for next time around. So it's not a new thing. It's just the basis of teacher training and always has been.
So who's the best judge of what evidence-based teaching is?
Yeah, well, let me take you on a little historical journey around what education is as a field of study, right? So evidence-based teaching is really a scientific term, and education is a field of science and always has been. It's been around as a field for a good 2,500 years, since Plato's time, but probably not as a field of science until the late 1800s. Science itself hasn't been around for that long. It's kind of like a 1700s type of thing. And what we mean by science is this practice of having a hypothesis, a thing that you think will work, and then putting it into practice and observing whether it did have the outcome that you expected. And if it didn't, changing some things. So that's really what science is. And it's certainly been the basis of education as a field of study since the late 1800s. And I'm sure your listeners will remember from their studies once upon a time doing Dewey, the great US educator. And he was so wedded to this idea of having an evidence base in education that he set up laboratory schools. And that was back in the late 1800s, where they were attached to the university in Chicago, and they were an opportunity for ideas, hypotheses about how kids learn to be put in place, to be tested and observed, and then to come up with, pedagogies, methods of instruction based on that. So it's certainly been around for a really long time, this idea of education as a science and a field of study. Now, who decides what constitutes evidence? Well, just like all sciences, in all these fields that we have, there's an academy. The academy is the group of experts, academics, educators who work together to ensure that these scientific experiments in our classrooms are valid and reliable. And the way they do this is through academic journals. Right? So there are literally hundreds of academic journals. And that's where knowledge is funneled through. Right? So the academic journals all have members of the academy on their boards and on their lists who do peer review. So, for example, if I did a study on something in the classroom field, like let's use one of mine that I did do. So I did a study looking to see whether drawing would improve writing outcomes. So if children drew before they wrote, would their writing be better? So that was my study. I conducted the study. I was a classroom teacher at the time. I conducted it in my own classroom. And my finding was, oh, goodness, they wrote better when I allowed them to draw first. But that can't just be a Misty did that in her classroom type of study, and therefore you should all believe me. I had to then submit that study to the academy via academic journals. And what that means is that a whole lot of other experts in the field read my study. They don't know I wrote it. It's all anonymous. And it gets sent to quite a few people from all different places around the world, all different universities.
Yep.
And they read it and they test it for its scientific method. They test it to see how valid it is, how reliable it is, how accurate my method was, and how accurate my analysis was. So it gets tested and you get feedback. You get feedback on perhaps you need to change this in your study. Did you consider this? Have you read this that's already happened? So you get a lot of feedback from these also anonymous academics. You don't know who they are. And then you respond to the feedback. Sometimes you respond by having an argument in place, but other times you respond by thinking, gosh, they were right. I really do need to change the study. I need to go back and do something different. So all of this is how the academy manages the science in the field of education. And it's definitely not a new thing. It has been around for more than 100 years. And so every teacher in Australia can rest assured that in their teacher education, they were the recipients of these heavily vetted scientific studies. Nobody in education in Australia was sitting there listening to the whim of one individual who did one thing once. Everybody is talking about, is teaching in universities in Australia from the academy, from this massive field of knowledge that's over 100 years old and, has a very strict system behind it. So that's really how we decide what evidence-based is. It comes through the academy into those journals. If you want something quicker than a journal, because it can take a couple of years for your study to find its way through the peer review system and into journals, then we have an interim stage, and that's the conference. So academics go and present findings from their studies at conferences, and they kind of open themselves up to their peers at the conference and say, well, what do you think? This is my kind of initial findings. This is what my study was. What do you think? And then you kind of take live in-person feedback from your peers that allow you to go back and think, okay, maybe I need to shift some things in my study. Maybe I didn't look up this person who'd already done work in this area. Maybe I hadn't considered this theorist. So there's that kind of interim stage as well. So those conferences aren't just junkets. They're a really important part of the building this kind of field of knowledge in education, building this field of evidence-based, really.
Where is that academy based?
So the academy is it's not an actual academy, although in Canberra we do actually have an Academy of Science, and it's an actual building. It's the notion of the academy. It's the faculties of teacher education around the world, or education psychology, all of them. So, for example, I get requests to kind of play an active part in the academy as a peer reviewer of those studies, probably twice a month. And they'll come from all sorts of different journals and different locations, but I will have been tapped on the shoulder, mostly because of expertise normally I get asked to review when it's an article that's around new educators, because that's what my PhD was about, new educators, or teaching English as an additional or second language, because that's been my professional expertise. And occasionally on things like spelling and writing, because that's also been an area of study for me. So you tend to get tapped on the shoulder as a member of the academy in an area that you have expertise in. And then you participate in it. You become this anonymous reviewer for studies that come in, and you give feedback and suggestions. But what you're trying to do is make sure that the evidence that is presented in that study has gone through a rigorous scientific method. You're looking very closely at the method that they chose, the data that they collected, how well they've described the participants, the students, how well they've described what they actually did, how well they've presented the data so you can understand the data, and how accurate their analysis of the data has been. So it's an incredibly intricate scientific process. And as I say, every teacher education student is the beneficiary of that. That's what their teacher educators are doing day in, day out, and then they present their knowledge to their teacher education students. And sometimes I think because when we're doing teacher education, when we're, young, Phil, and we're just kind of out of high school and we're thinking, I'd love to be a teacher, sometimes all of this scientific method study that you're doing at university can feel like, oh, why are we doing this? Can't we just get on to the part where you're with kids in the classroom? And of course we can get onto that part, but it's so important that we consider the field behind what we're doing, the big field of study behind what we're doing, so that we are actually working from an evidence base. But sometimes it's hard to appreciate that when you're 20 and just want to get into a classroom and work with kids.
So ultimately, all this knowledge that's been developed over 100 years or so, is it a process of keeping the best of what we learn, and some of what we learn doesn't work in a classroom, so we don't use that? Is it kind of just getting better and better in what we are finding out?
Yeah, such an excellent question. So there, I think there's two, because basically it's kind of getting to that question of, well, gosh, if we've got 100 years of study, why don't we just know what works, and why don't we just do that? Right? And there's kind of two big reasons, I think, why we can't just say, oh, well, yeah, we've done 100 years of study and we found out this is the one that works. So I'm going to take the first reason first, and that's context. So part of the scientific method is this, Phil, that it's got to be repeatable, right? You have to, what you did in one context, you need to be able to repeat in the next context, and you have to get the same results. That's actually what science is, right? And in science, as we all think of it, those lab experiments that we did, it's very easy to control the variables, right? You can make sure that you've used the same size test tube. You can make sure that the water was exactly the same temperature. You can make sure that you put exactly the same amount of sodium in. Right? You can control all of the variables. But it turns out that in the classroom, the variables are so many that they are impossible to control. Right. So what happens in one context, in one scientific experiment, so let's say, for example, my experiment that I did when I was a classroom teacher, seeing whether the children wrote better after they drew, there were some variables in there, Phil. And one of the important variables was that I had a very small class. So I only had 13 kids in the class, and they were English additional language learners. So that really means that we could only say that my experiment and my finding that children write better when they draw first, we can only say for sure that that could be true if you had 13 kids and they were all English additional language speakers and that they were 9 years old, no? Because they were the variables I had in place. Yep. So clearly, nobody's ever going to repeat those conditions again. So in my experiment, I can only say, I found this to be true under these conditions.
Right.
You can try it. Your conditions may be different, so I can't guarantee you'll get the result, but you can try it under your conditions. So you can make your experiment now using mine as the basis, but you will have changed the variables. Now, I think this is the thing that people forget about educational research. So, for example, you might find a research study, or somebody may present to you a research study and say, look, we have used this in a classroom, we've done a research on this, and we found that the students made 3 months improvement compared to students who didn't have this program. And you might think, oh, well, that's good, 3 months improvement. But then you have to ask the question, so what were the conditions? What were the variables in your experiment? And then when they tell you, well, it was a special education class, the students had Down syndrome, and there were 7 students in the class, then goodness me, you've changed an awful lot of variables. So it's like, oh, gosh, well, I'll give it a go in my classroom, but there are so many variables that don't apply. And so it's highly unlikely that that same intervention will work in my class of 28 5-year-olds. Highly unlikely.
Yep.
And we can go the same way, right? I could go conversely. I could say, well, actually, we did a great intervention with a class of year 6 students where it was completely student-led inquiry into the writing process. And we had great results. They wrote this amount, the quality of the writing was this. But then I teach a class of 6-year-olds for whom all English is an additional language. So that's a very different variables, right, than a class of native speaking 12-year-olds. So the likelihood that that same intervention of student-led inquiry into the writing process applying into my year one class of English additional language learners is very unlikely to work because we change so many variables. This is the problem with programs, right? Programs assume that wherever that program worked, the variables will always be like that in any classroom that they go into. And that will never be the case. Never, ever be the case. Anybody who tells you that a program done here will work in your classroom is actually being very unscientific because they've completely ignored the concept of validity and reliability and the importance of maintaining same conditions and variables when repeating an experiment. So it's actually a very non-scientific way to think about teaching.
Why does that kind of thinking come in, do you think?
I think because it seems so beguilingly simple.
Right.
Well, but this has worked, and so take it into your classroom and it will work. And people don't ask the question, under what circumstances did it work? Who were the students? How many were there? What were the conditions? So I just think it just feels very simple, and people think, well, it's kind of easier than teachers being the scientists. And that's completely the wrong way to think about education. The teachers are the scientists. They're not the lab assistants. They're just there throwing out a program. They are literally the scientists.
Right.
And they were trained to be scientists in their 4-year degree, Phil. So that other thing that my undergrads always disliked doing so much was writing out the lesson plan. But the lesson plan, Phil, was actually the write-up of the scientific method. The lesson plan was, think of it as the micro application of science, right? It's what's the goal of the lesson? So variously over the years, we've called that the aim or the outcome or the intention. But every experiment has this goal. And then you're thinking, okay, so I've got the goal in mind. What materials do I need for that? And so you have your materials. And then you're thinking, okay, so what would be the steps that I would need then to get to that goal? So that's your pedagogy. It's your method, right? What's your method? In a lesson plan, you are also thinking, what do I need to do to mitigate those variables that I know are in my classroom? And those are all those differentiation things that you are asked to do in your lesson planning. How are you going to mitigate for the fact that some of your kids have English as their first language and some don't? How are you going to mitigate for the fact that some of your kids have a specific language learning difficulty and some don't? So you are asked to do some mitigation around variables. So it's quite complex scientific method, right? And then at the end of it, you're asked to assess. So were the goals reached? And that was the assessment. And then, of course, you found that, oh, gosh, they weren't reached for everyone. So you were asked to evaluate. You're asked to think, how would you conduct this experiment differently next time so that you get success for everyone? So that lesson plan, and let's face it, a teacher needs to do that kind of thinking at least 3 times a day. At least 3 times a day, right? That is complex scientific method thinking that they were trained at university for 4 years to do. That's longer than a scientist trains. So well trained in the method and having to conduct that method 2-3 times a day, 5 days a week for the whole school year. And
then in multiple scenarios after that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the teacher is the scientist, and it's such a disingenuous thing to do to think, oh, well, actually, let's just give them a packaged program that somebody wrote.
Yep.
It's not scientific because it can't respond to the variables in the classroom. And it's completely ignoring the expertise the scientific expertise of the teacher
Yep.
who has been trained in gathering evidence.
Yep. That's pretty profound. Because I think there is a lot of thinking out there that is not in that scientific way. So,
And yet, ironically, is probably labelling itself science.
yes. Why is that? Why are they grabbing that science badge?
Because science has the ring of validity around it, right? And as it should. I agree. I'm a scientist, Phil. I call myself a scientist. I did not do a 4-year BEd and then a master's and then a PhD and not be called a scientist.
Yeah.
So because all of that, every part of it, including all those years in the classroom, were about developing my scientific brain, being able to do all those things that I just described to you then, that teachers do day in and day out. I watch them to this day, Phil. So, of course, it has this strong validity around it. And so, of course, people want to own it. Only, when they start owning it by putting a capital S on it and selling it,
yes,
then that's improper.
Yep. And the other one that's being used is evidence-based teaching, or an evidence-based program, or...
I think what's wrong with that, Phil, is that it's so, I think I used the word before, it's disingenuous. What do people think teachers have been doing all these years? Of course, all of their teaching has been evidence-based. They've come through degrees that were completely evidence-based, and they do their teaching every day on the basis of gathering evidence. So it's very odd to suddenly assume that, oh, well, they haven't been doing that, have they? So we should do a bit of evidence-based stuff now. It's just completely disrespectful of the profession. Completely. Yeah. I definitely would label the teaching I do as scientific and evidence-based.
Yep.
I'm pretty much sure that most people could. Because most people have been through a 4-year scientific degree and then each day engage in this evidence base of applying the teaching, observing it, assessing it, evaluating it, and shifting their practice on the basis of that evidence.
Yes, because we did this great podcast with Di Snowball and Kay Cobbin, that the science of reading is a whole body of knowledge that we all own.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely it is. So it's not just one thing. And as I said, it's the actual, for me, that science of teaching was the actual joy of teaching. It's what I loved the most was this careful thought about what's required to reach that goal, and then what will I do to get them there, and then the thinking about, oh gosh, so what happened that this child didn't get it?
Yeah.
What do I need to do next? That's the real, that's the amazing part of teaching. You're kind of solving these micro scientific conundrums every day.
And we'll take a break there from part 1 of our podcast. We look forward to you joining us for part 2. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.